Thank you very much for the warm welcome. Two things before I start my lecture. First, my apologies to those from Göttingen. Trying to get away from your usual university lectures and then to find me here to be the day of your conference. Second, just for those who might be interested in my recent publications, you will find them down there. Ladies and gentlemen, dear organizing committee, and may I also say, dear friends of Europe. I felt very honored when I was invited to talk here in front of so many enthusiastic and, may I say, involved students from all over Europe. Though, yes, the process of European integration has surely seen many times of crisis and has experienced countless backlashes, hardly anyone would deny that we are now in the middle of one of the most challenging times in its recent history. It should be enough to simply mention the Euro crisis, Brexit. Hands up from the UK, anyone? Sorry. And the following migration crisis of populist voices, not only in Europe but worldwide, to make clear how important the following months and years, especially for the younger generation gathered here today. They decide in what kind of Europe this generation will end its studies and where it will found its families. In a Europe of walls and frontiers, not only in the head of people, but actual walls, frontiers. Nations obsessed with trying to over-trump the others. By the way, a concept making its needlessness more than evident by including the name of the just as needless American president. Or in unity and solidarity, in which the peoples of Europe come together in order to achieve prosperity, freedom, and peace for all. So that, let me just get a little declamatory, the well-known pursuit of happiness becomes indeed possible for everyone, including the United Kingdom. Agree. Still a long way to go. We are clearly not there yet, though national tendencies have at least declined in the last months. The European Union still appears to be starting to fray at its fringes. It has recently not only lost one of its member states, but also significant parts of its citizens, especially in the states, have lost their belief in the European project, more than understandable when looking at status. Concepts like these, however, are more than important and play a vital role when trying to achieve the above-mentioned aim. Thank you very much for giving me the possibility to contribute to your specific effort by motivating you all here to continue to out and to participate in the current discussions going on about the future of the European Union and Europe. That is our European Union and our Europe. Now, as the title of my little presentation tries to make clear, mainly but not exclusively about the problems of the Eurozone and how these might be solved. I would like to address also the situation of the European Union as a whole. And that necessarily includes, I'm very, very sorry, at least brief insight into the upcoming Brexit negotiations, as Brexit surely stands for a break in the history of European integration and, unfortunately, could still result in absolute disaster. I know you heard a very positive outlook yesterday. Actually, I'm very optimistic also, but it could still end in absolute disaster, depends on the law, but on the act negotiating. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me first start by solving the problems of the Eurozone. As an academic, I obviously am more than capable to do so. I am practically paid for knowing it better than anyone else, and the only thing regrettable is the fact that in most cases, nobody listens. Ladies and gentlemen, the treaties have a clear view on the future of the Eurozone. All member states have committed themselves to introduce the euro at some point in the future. Limited exceptions exist only for Denmark and the United Kingdom, while the latter will obviously be obsolete as soon as Brexit has been completed. All other member states, and this is true also for Sweden, are normatively obliged to enter the Eurozone. Their commitment is not merely of a political nature. Their status as member state with an exception is thus not supposed to last till eternity, even though the treaties obviously include no exact date as to when this joining of the Eurozone has to be completed, as this question is dependent on the respective economic data. So, from a normative perspective, the debate on the future of the Eurozone should mainly be a joining debate. However, this is obviously not the case. The developments of 2010, generally summarized as Euro crisis, in actual fact led to a general discussion regarding necessary and comprehensive reforms, possible entries of further member states a mere side problem, if at all. The experience of the last years have thus highlighted the fact that the structure of the Economic Monetary Union, the EMU, suffers from severe constructional deficits, and overcoming these in the near future will probably be necessary in order to ensure that there is any future of the Eurozone at all. Or, in other words, there is a lot more at stake than missing the mere normative joining goal. Though the mantra repeated again and again by the German Chancellor, a failing euro means a failing Europe, surely goes too far, at least in its apodictic certainty. Though the biggest turbulences were successfully eliminated with the financial aids granted and punctual reform steps taken, these measures were solely able to buy the necessary time for greater and more fundamental reforms. The euro crisis is therefore far from being over, but is smoldering in the background and might return sooner than later if this time span now is wasted. But what kind of reform is necessary to prevent a fraying Eurozone from falling apart completely? And what could they look like in detail? In order to find the answer to these questions, it is necessary to take at least a brief look at the actual causes of the euro crisis in order to understand the above-mentioned constructural deficits that then need to be eliminated. Ladies and gentlemen, the fact that the euro crisis occurred shortly after the biggest worldwide financial crisis in decades is indeed no coincidence. The following economic downfall and the necessity to save domestic financial institutions led to an extreme burden on the national budgets of practically all member states, and let national debt levels rise sharply within just a few months. However, it would be an unjustified simplification, and in the end simply unfounded, to transfer the responsibility for the euro crisis completely onto the recessional phase in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Not only were the problems of Greece and Italy mainly self-inflicted. Anyone from Italy here? No one from Italy? Okay, they're solving the internal problems probably. But the euro crisis also revealed significant constructional deficits of the structure of the Eurozone. Deficits well known, at least, since its founding in 1999. According to these, two core factors were responsible for the financial turmoil the Eurozone has been in since 2010. One, the economic heterogeneity of the participating member states that, due to a missing fiscal and economic policy, was not diminished, but rather increased in the following years, making single and fitting policy more difficult or even impossible. Two, monetary devaluation within a monetary union made necessary reform in the respective member states extremely painful for its peoples. Let us take a closer look at these two factors. First, the economic heterogeneity. Though economic scholars have indeed pointed out that the creation of a monetary union can be beneficiary for the participating member states by reducing transactional costs and risks, it's absolutely clear that the necessary transfer of monetary competence risks of following monetary policy. Monetary policy within a monetary union is necessarily a common monetary policy that, thus, needs to fit to all its member states. It is more or less undisputed, therefore, that the creation of a monetary union only makes sense as far as the economies of the participating member states show some sort of homogeneity in order to allow for such a common monetary policy. Problems are otherwise bound to occur. The money, to put it simple, will leave less and go to more competitive areas, obviously leading to massive problems in the no-money areas that then try to be solved by picking up debt. In other words, the costs for creating the monetary union then outstrip its benefits. The EMU area, however, was never an optimal monetary area in this sense. In actual fact, it combined not only extremely different economic philosophies, but also extremely divergent economies as regards their development. Today, sometimes paraphrased in the opposite pair of northern versus southern member states. The Maastricht Treaty, we have people from Netherlands here, right? Yeah. Welcome. The Maastricht Treaty indeed demanded so-called convergence criteria to ensure that the participating member states at least fulfilled certain economic at the time of their EMU. The other member states, however, did not check their fulfillment with the necessary strictness and accepted not only very creative forms of budgeting, but higher debt levels than required by the treaty. Due to the lacking common fiscal and economic policies, these inhomogeneities in actual fact even intensified in the following years. Or to quote Harold James from Princeton University, the fundamental problem of the European Monetary Union lies in its incompleteness or loop-sidedness. There was a much better preparation for the monetary side of the monetary union than for the fiscal concomitants that should have underpinned its. End of quote. Germany at least managed to introduce Stability Act, but this agreement was not treated with the necessary sincerity, so that failing to comply with its requirements was more and more seen as a forgivable sin, making rising debt levels, especially in the southern states, more the normality than the exception. Above this, further developments in the respective member states were not identified as the threat for the European Monetary Union. They actually were. Now, this is true especially for varying wage policies. Within a monetary union, ladies and gentlemen, the participating member states have to ensure that wage rises are strictly linked to rises in productivity. The otherwise sinking competitiveness cannot be stopped by monetary devaluation, nor by an individual monetary policy for the respective member state. When designing the EMU, it was hoped that the member states would and refrain from too high wages. Anyone from Greece? Hi. Italy, Spain, apparently, yes. And needed its productivity rises by far, while Germany, anybody from Germany? Okay. And Austria, no, even introduced real wage cuts. The following major macroeconomic imbalances were recognized as a problem neither by the member states nor by the Union. People here from Germany know, even worse, Germany regularly was celebrated for being export world champion. Completely, I would like to emphasize this, neglecting normative requirements not only from the European Union, but also from national legislation, where not having such an imbalance is actually part of the German economic policy, or has to be part of the German economic policy. This continued part of the member states led to inflation spreads within the European Monetary Union, not only but also due to the Balassa-Samuelson effect. I don't want to go into that too much, but just believe me that Greece and other southern countries realized or were confronted with a higher inflation rate, a much higher inflation rate than, for instance, Germany at the time. And just think of the European Central Bank then. It was either too expansive or too restrictive when it took its measures. One size, one central bank, fits none of the member states. The fiscal breakdown of the southern member states, therefore, was only a question of time, with the financial crisis merely acting as a catalyzer. Trying to get rid of these macroeconomic imbalances and regaining the respective competitiveness was thus necessary, and everybody agreed on that. However, national and EU measures to achieve this goal were so much more difficult within the European Monetary Union, where devaluations are impossible. Conceivable are only real devaluations, meaning nothing less than a massive and sudden reduction of wages, with prices at first remaining more or less the same. And I'm sure our member of Greece will be able to give you quite a few stories on that. Due to the long-lasting too high wage rises, wage cuts of up to 30% appeared necessary, measures so severe consequences for the concerned workers that it sounds more than euphemistic to simply call them tough or hard. The events make this more than visible. However, in a monetary union, there is no other way. Though, and that needs to be emphasized, and I'm saying that especially here in Germany, this is not true for the design of the austerity policy in detail, especially as regards its timing element and the consideration of its social impact. And again, I would like to ask you all to talk to our Greece member here in order to inform yourself about the social impact this austerity policy actually has had in Greece. Ladies and gentlemen, what can we conclude from this brief overview as regards the necessary reforms, longer-lasting reforms of the Eurozone? I believe at least the following two things. First, it seems absolutely clear that the European Monetary Union will not be able to exist in the long run without enhancing economic and fiscal cooperation between the member states. And indeed, despite the financial aids granted, first steps in this direction have been undertaken in several legislative packages. Six-pack, two-pack, Euro Plus Pact, Pact for More, at the Fiscal Compact. You've all heard of this in the news. However, this legislation mainly concentrates on more or less liberation commitments by the member states and on introducing even stricter rules as regards the national debt level. History has shown, however, that rules in this area generally lack the necessary assertiveness. Remember, we had similar rules from the word go, the Stability and Growth Pact, for instance. It is unclear, therefore, why these rules should now be obeyed with the necessary strictness by all the member states. And second, and this might come as a surprise, especially to German scholars, the institutional structure of the European central banks, the ESCB, needs no major adjustments. In actual fact, the ESCB, with the ECB at the top, has proven its capacity to act not only in normal times, but also in times of crisis. It is equipped with the necessary instruments needed for the setting of the single monetary policy, and was even capable of buying the necessary time for reforms. Its measures might have been unorthodox, though compared to other major central banks, they actually were not. But this should not be confused with their illegality. Its main and most successful measures, including the OMT program, respect its normative mandate, though again, some German scholars refuse to accept this and cannot refrain from suggesting otherwise to the public. I therefore truly believe that we should not change the structure of the ESCB, nor should we restrict the instruments given to the ECB by its statute, as some German economists have recently asked for. And this is something I would like to emphasize by saying, if anybody is to blame for the euro crisis, it is not the ECB, but the member states themselves. The public impression, especially here in Germany, may be different. It is nonetheless false. And just to round things up, This is true also for the current monetary policy of the ECB. The fact that German politicians and some scholars disagree with the decision of the ECB Council does not mean that the ECB is acting beyond its mandate. So, how could longer-lasting reforms look like, taking these two into account? Let me briefly discuss options that are currently in the United States. That is, changing the mandate of the European Stability Mechanism, make it a European Monetary Fund, the 5 Presidents' Report of 2015, and thirdly, a Eurozone budget that has just recently come up after the election in France. So first, changing the ESM mandate. Ladies and gentlemen, the European Stability Mechanism, ESM, was introduced in 2012 to coordinate the lending to member states unable to finance themselves on the financial markets. The ESM takes up the necessary financial resources on the financial markets, guaranteed by the member states of the Eurozone, and then passes these on to the respective member states. To obtain these credits, these member states need to oblige themselves to the necessary reforms. The ESM, therefore, only comes into play when the economic and financial situation of a member state has already led to some form of financial crisis. The ESM currently acts as a crisis eliminator. Especially German politicians have now proposed to extend this mandate of the ESM in order to enable it to intervene at an earlier stage and to act more as a crisis preventer. To achieve this goal, it would have to be equipped with far-reaching advisory and possibly even intervention instruments comparable to those of the International Monetary Fund, IMF. As a somewhat neutral actor, such a new ESM would then be able to point to possible budgetary and fiscal problems of a member state at an early stage and could demand the necessary adjustments. To increase reform pressure, financial aids that might be necessary sometime in the future could be linked to the implementation of the aforementioned proposals made by the ESM. Such an extension of the mandate of the ESM would, of course, require changing its legal basis. That, however, is a simple international treaty. An amendment would therefore not need to run through the complex amendment procedure of Article 48 TEU. Yet, it appears questionable whether such an amendment alone would be able to solve the constructional deficits of the Eurozone, as the member states would still not be bound to the necessary economic, wage, and fiscal policy. The European level would gain no area. The new advisory may lead to problems as regards the democratic legitimacy of ESM. Second, the 5 Presidents' Report. The President's Report was presented in 2015 by Jean-Claude Tusk. Anyone from Poland here? Luxembourg? Okay. Jeroen Dijsselbloem, the Netherlands there. Mario Draghi and Martin Schulz, the then presidents of the Commission, the European Council, the Eurogroup, the ECB, and the European Parliament. It was titled Completing Europe's Economic and Monetary Union and laid down that progress had to happen on 4 fronts. First, towards a genuine economic union that ensures each economy has the structural features to prosper within the monetary union. Second, towards a financial union that guarantees monetary and increases risk sharing with the private sector. This means completing the banking union and accelerating the capital markets union. Third, towards a fiscal union that delivers both financial sustainability and stabilization. And finally, towards a political union that provides the foundation for all the above through genuine democratic accountability, legitimacy, and institutional strengthening. The report then proposes 2 steps to achieve this aim. Stage 1, starting July 15 and ending the end of June 2017. The so-called deepening by doing phase, ladies and gentlemen. Here, the European institutions and the euro area member states would build on existing instruments and best possible use of the existing treaty. And then stage 2, in 2020, complete concrete measures of a more far-reaching nature would be agreed to complete EMU's economic and institutional architecture. This includes integrating the ESM into the EU law work and setting up a euro area treasury accountable. Altogether, the report appears as a somewhat politically proposal that gets along without any treaty changes, at least in its stage 1. Yet, that might be exactly its problem. There will be no transfer of economic and fiscal competences to the European level until the end of stage 2. Until then, the proposal is stronger and even more complex coordination within the European semester, which is no qualitative jump compared to the current situation. Why this new form of coordination function better than before remains unclear. What would be a real change indeed, a treasury that, according to the report, could stand at the end of stage 2. And now in 2015, such a step seemed far from being achievable, so that a 10-year time span appeared comprehensible. This is different today, however. Emmanuel Macron, anyone from France here? Oh, bonjour. The new French president, which we all love, and obviously every French citizen adores. Am I right? More or less, okay. Well, anyway, the new French president made clear during his campaign that he wants such a Eurozone finance minister and a Eurozone budget rather sooner than later. And during his first visit to Germany, less than 2 weeks ago, the German Chancellor agreed to stronger economic cooperation. And the installation of a Eurozone budget is now being discussed by a French-German task force, expected to present first results already in July 2017. So in what way could such a Eurozone budget contribute to the functioning of the European Monetary Union? Could it be a solution for the future? Well, by introducing a Eurozone budget and a Eurozone finance minister, the Eurozone itself would gain the possibility to actively influence the fiscal and economic policy within the European Monetary Union, in order to contribute to the necessary economic convergence of the member states. The funds of such a budget could be used, depending on its legal design, to finance investments into weaker regions, or to supplement the national social systems as a first step to a European social security system. Economic downfalls could then be at least partly absorbed by some form of European automatic stabilizers, improving the social situation of this population, and thus contributing also, and this is very important, ladies and gentlemen, also to the legitimacy of the European Union as a whole. The peoples of Europe might finally have the impression that the European Union is actually helping them in times of need, and not just, if at all, their own member states. In a first step, such a Eurozone budget would thus not replace the national budgets completely, but rather complement these in specific areas important for the EMU. The budget would be led by a Euro finance minister who would have to be accountable to some sort of Eurozone parliament. The introduction of such a budget would thus necessarily include major adjustments of the existing treaties. Due to the French election, it today nevertheless appears as a realistic and suitable option that, maybe combined with a changing of the ESM mandate, those two could go together, could present an indeed sustainable solution for the Eurozone in the future. But to be distinguished from the question whether to introduce a Eurozone budget or not is the highly politically and surely disputed question how to finance such a budget. Where is the money supposed to come from, ladies and gentlemen? Now, three possible options exist. One, binding contributions by the member states, financed by the member states themselves, according to their national budget rules. Two, a surcharge on a national tax that is then directly transferred to the Eurozone budget. Or three, introduction of a special European tax. Though this is obviously a highly political question, I believe that the introduction of a specific European tax would be preferable for two reasons. First of all, such a tax would ensure the necessary independence of the Eurozone budget from the developments within the member states. Contributions would have to be agreed upon by the member states, and as the regular debates on the EU budget show, such agreements can be very difficult to achieve. And second of all, and maybe even more important, a European tax would prevent the financial resources used being interpreted as national money given to the EU, and finally to other member states. The financial resources would at no point be a part of the national budget, preventing possible solidarity problems within the member states. The euro crisis itself made visible that friendship or solidarity ends with money, to use a German saying, even in the EU. And though this might seem regrettable from a European perspective, one will have to accept this as a fact and try to prevent any solidarity problems from the word go. And that would be possible with a European tax. The German Social Democratic Party, SPD, recently proposed to use the revenues of a financial transaction tax for this purpose. In my opinion, a good idea, as the financial markets indeed not only contributed to the euro crisis, but also still enjoy a somewhat privileged position when it comes to taxes, a position simply not justified in my eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, maybe one last comment on the financing of this fantastic Eurozone budget idea that appears more than justified here in Germany, where the financial crisis and the following euro crisis have led to some sort of irrational debt phobia. I would therefore like to emphasize the introduction of such a Eurozone budget would not have to be accompanied by the introduction of Eurobonds. That is, common bonds jointly guaranteed by all the member states of the EMU. Especially German politicians have made clear that such a common guarantee is, if at all, possible in the very, 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 very long run. A Eurozone budget, however, would be operational without the possibility to take up debt from the financial markets. This is something that should not be mixed up and brought together in order to argument against a Eurozone budget. Ladies and gentlemen, this necessary reform of the Eurozone will have to occur in a time in which the European Union as a whole is facing one of its biggest challenges in its recent history, maybe in all its history. Making things not easier, obviously, and this is where I come to the second and, don't worry, a lot shorter part of my thoughts. The decision of the British people, I would like to apologize already at this point, to leave the European Union, the so-called Brexit, will for the first time lead to a reduction of the European Union as regards the number of its member states. Before then, the history of the European Union was a history of extension. Extension not only of member states, but also extension of integration intensity. The Brexit procedure that was formally triggered at the end of March, with Theresa May delivering her partly handwritten letter to Donald Tusk, will now be followed by intense negotiations that will have to be completed by the beginning of 2019. It's the beginning, not March, beginning of 2019, as we need the ratification by the European Parliament and by the British Parliament in the aftermath of the agreement. And though these negotiations are currently suspended, we obviously have time and affluence, ladies and gentlemen, until the general election in June 2017 and are supposed to start June 19, the temperature in the Brexit kettle is clearly rising. If you need any proof for the rising tensions, then just remember the Brexit dinner that took place at the beginning of May in Downing Street number 10, and that apparently did not go all that well. Quote, "She is living in another galaxy." Mr. Juncker is quoted referring to Theresa May and continues, quote, "She simply has not yet understood the complexity of the whole matter." Brussels gossip, Theresa May replied, and repeated her mantra, "Brexit is going to be a success," while making clear that she can be a bloody difficult woman. Brexit cannot be a success, was the short but sobering answer by Mr. Juncker, who at least acknowledged that the Prime Minister was indeed a tough lady. Now, obviously, a lot of this dispute between the Prime Minister and the President of the Commission is rooted in negotiation tactics. Both sides want to bring themselves into good starting positions. Whether they were, or rather who was successful, we will see. But however, as the actual negotiation process is coming near, it is obviously becoming more and more evident to both sides that Brexit is no fast-selling item, and that its outcome is more or less open and still more or less open. And when looking at the guidelines passed recently by the European Council, we can indeed see at least 4 areas that might lead to major problems in the coming months. 1, timing of the negotiations. The guidelines make clear that the negotiations will consist of 2 phases. Phase 1, settling the disentanglement of the UK from the EU, that is, agreeing on an exit agreement. Phase 2, finding an overall understanding on the framework for the future relationship under Article 50 TEU. And only when sufficient progress has been reached concerning Phase 1 will the European Council unanimously allow the negotiations to proceed to Phase 2. The final agreement on a future relationship between the EU and the UK will only be finalized once the UK has become a third country, in other words, after Brexit. And what about Theresa May on this? She has asked for parallel negotiations and obviously repeated this request at the above-mentioned Brexit dinner at the beginning of May, which is why Mr. Juncker said she is obviously living in another galaxy. And I'm sure that it's the European Union that will succeed as regards the timing, because there is nothing that the UK could do apart from not negotiating at all, and that is obviously not an option. However, I do believe that negotiations on the Phase 2 could then start maybe October, November of this year, maybe at the beginning of 2018, making it at least not completely impossible to find an agreement until 2019. Now, as regards the content of Phase 1, agreeing reciprocal guarantees to safeguard the status and rights derived from EU law at the date of withdrawal of EU and UK citizens will, and their families, by the way, affected by the Brexit, will be first priority for the European Union. The EU thereby wants to, quote, ensure effective, enforceable, non-discriminatory and comprehensive lifelong guarantees for these citizens, including the right to acquire permanent residence. And Theresa May? Well, taking back control was one of the main reasons for Brexit, and introducing lifelong guarantees for maybe millions of EU citizens. By the way, exactly those EU citizens that are there today and apparently are such a big problem, and their families, is hardly compatible with this idea. And there will be the necessity for some judicial remedy for those EU citizens deprived of these rights. Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator for the European Union, has pointed out that he wants the European Court of Justice to be competent to deal with these questions. This, however, is clearly unacceptable to Mrs. May. She, on the other hand, suggested the Supreme Court to be competent to do this, which is, again, completely unacceptable for the European Union, obviously. In the end, we might find some form of new dispute resolution system equivalent to the one agreed upon in the CETA negotiations. Maybe a mixed panel with EU and UK judges of some sort. We will see. Now, this is all phase one, ladies and gentlemen, not phase two. And only if we agree significantly on this phase one makes progress, we will get to phase two. Now, phase one also has to include, and this is very important for the European Union, and no phase two without this, has also got to include a single financial settlement, covering all commitments as well as liabilities, including contingent liabilities. The European Union wants the UK to pay all its financial obligations it had agreed to before its Brexit decision. Though no concrete sum has yet been published, rumors speak of obligations between 60 and 100 billion euro in order to clear the accounts. Above that, the EU believes that the UK should also pay for the EU institutions moving from the UK somewhere else in the EU. As regards the European Banking Authority, for instance, hopefully Frankfurt, anyway, another 350 million euro. Now that might sound a lot for moving an institution from one place to another, but the problem are long-lasting renting agreements the EBA has already agreed to in London. Theresa May, on the other hand, has repeatedly remarked that Article 50 says nothing about financial obligations, and at least publicly makes the impression that the UK is not willing to pay anything at all. And you have to be very strong now. Just a few days ago, Boris Johnson, the British foreign minister, in one of his well-established weird appearances, trumpeted out that if anybody had to pay for Brexit, it was the EU. Now, ladies and gentlemen, leaving Boris Johnson's more comedy-like statement aside, obviously Theresa May knows that the fact that Article 50 TEU says nothing about finances does not mean that the exit agreement would be banned from including such provisions. And clearly she also knows that the EU can and will not allow the UK to exit for free, leaving the other member states covering for UK's lost financial and legally binding promises concerning the financial agenda until 2020. So in the end, as again the bargaining position of the UK is pretty weak, I'm sure that the UK will pay some sort of Brexit bill, and comments made by David Davis already point in this direction. How much needs to be seen? Probably somewhere between 30 and 70 billion euro over a certain period of time. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, continuing to support and protect the achievements, benefits and commitments of the peace process in Northern Ireland, making flexible and imaginative, that is a quote by the way, imaginative solutions necessary, including the aim of avoiding a hard border while respecting the integrity of the Union legal order, is another priority of the EU. Now, finally, this is something both sides agree upon. Yet the problem here is no one really knows an answer, and how these imaginative solutions could look like, as the border to Northern Ireland will be an external border of the European Union. Though it is clear that Ireland will not be able to enter the Schengen area, because that would make a hard border absolutely necessary, and Ireland has refrained from doing so with respect to Northern Ireland until now already, the peace in Northern Ireland is so fragile that any form of border might bring back the violence that was only more or less eliminated with the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. How Theresa May, I'm nearly over with Brexit, how Theresa May can still go on repeating her mantra that, quote, no deal is better than a bad deal, is simply not understandable. Ladies and gentlemen, this very brief overview makes clear that Brexit will occupy significant resources of the European Union, resources so desperately needed for the necessary reforms of the Eurozone, but also the European Union as a whole. Without being too declamatory, it is the European idea that is at stake. An idea that has led not only to peace and freedom, but also to a prosperity unknown to practically all other areas of the world. This idea, ladies and gentlemen, needs to be defended against national tendencies gaining influence in all parts of the world. It is for us all to stand up for these ideas and to convince those skeptical of its advantages. However, several things need to be respected in order to make this process a success. First of all, as regards the internal discussion process, standing up for the European Union and for the European idea does not mean to stand up for this European Union as it has evolved over the last decades. Being critical to the existing EU is not equivalent to being critical to the European idea. We need an open discussion on the future of the EU, and the Commission's recently published 5 proposals can form the basis for such a discussion. And managing to reform the Eurozone will have to be the necessary starting point to this overall reform of the European Union. The French-German initiative of the last days is therefore not only to be welcomed, but we should all try to assist in making it a success. Second of all, I do not believe that the member states are obsolete in the near future or even ever, as some scholars, not only in Germany, assume. The European Union needs strong member states, just as the member states need a strong European Union. The 5 proposals of the Commission therefore rightly include no option in which the member states are abolished completely. The national identity is strongly rooted in the people's minds, and I truly believe that this, as itself, does not have to be a bad thing as long as nationalism is understood in a positive and open way. Such an open nationalism not only accepts other nations and their identities, but wants to cooperate with these and is also capable of providing the necessary solidarity in times of crisis. It is true that nationalism can and often has been abused. That is why we have to find better ways to cope with that sort of negative and fencing nationalism. We are, or rather the European Union wants to be, a value-based union. The developments in Poland and Hungary, anybody from there here today, have shown, however, that these values are constantly at stake and cannot be taken for granted. The European Union, though, still lacks the necessary instruments to enforce these values and to enhance positive nationalism. Here it should be made clear: either respect the values agreed upon or leave the European Union. As Brexit shows, this is a possible solution. Ladies and gentlemen, better a smaller but value-united European Union than a bigger one in which values are simply ignored, disrespected, or openly fought against. Thirdly and finally, as regards negotiations with the United Kingdom, these will only be a success if the remaining 27 stand united until the end. So far, there is good reason for reserved optimism. The above-mentioned guidelines, for instance, were passed by the European Council in record time, apparently in just about 4 minutes. Although they do indeed contain several aspects one would have been able to argue about, especially if one thinks of the recent meetings of the European Council, where finding a consensus either failed or took all night. Ladies and gentlemen, and this is where I come to the end, never let a good crisis go to waste is something Winston Churchill has apparently said. The European Union is currently facing a lot more than just one crisis, and will hopefully let not one of them pass unused. The capacity to compromise will be just as necessary as the willingness to drop national reservations. Then, I am truly convinced we will be able to prevent a fraying Eurozone and a fraying European Union. Thank you.